And welcome back into Good Morning Maine.
We are here with Morgan Talty. He is the author of the recently debuted book, Night of the Living Res. Morgan, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Can you explain a bit of the book for us or what it's about?
Yeah, so Night of the Living Res is 12 interconnected stories all told from the point of view of David, or D, David being a child narrator and D being the older version of him. And they're all stories that stand alone, but when you read them together, they form sort of this larger story about what happened to this family, what happened to Dee and David's family. And it really focuses a lot on, it's set on the Penobscot Nation in Maine, where I grew up, and it focuses on themes of addiction, of love, family, relationships, and so on, things that are very close to myself and my heart, I guess.
So the name Night of the Living Res, is that a play on Night of the Living Dead at all?
It is, yeah, it is. Yeah, when I wrote the very first story for this book, Night of the Living Res, it was there's a scene where that film is playing, and I decided to title it that, and it just sounded catchy, and I thought it was
no spoilers.
Yeah, no spoilers, none at all, none at all.
Right, and maybe that has to feed in with themes of addiction and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I think we think of zombies as these dead, these undead, these dead things, and one of the central questions to this book is how did the living come back to life? And so I'm not saying these characters are zombies by any means, but I think there's certainly a metaphor there that is built between the living and the dead.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting how you say that there's multiple stories that kind of intertwine into one. That's kind of what, as a reader, when you're looking at it in a movie, in any sort of media that goes on, we always want to look for what's the next one. How does this all connect and everything? It brings real interest into a story.
Yeah, and it's I love interconnected story collections. I love the ones that are able to you can read the stories in any order, but then if you read them collectively, by the end you're like, wow, that was I got a novel and I got a story in a way.
So it's not necessarily chronological throughout Dee's life.
No, it is, but it isn't. So there'll be a D story and then a David story, a D story, and a David story. And I like to imagine it as if you pulled them all out, you'd have all the David stories and all the D stories, and then a gap of time missing. Oh. And those are the questions that you're kind of asking, and you get the answers to, by the end.
Gotcha. Interesting. Now, throughout your writing, you're kind of writing in two separate narrators. You have, it's the same person, but different life experience. How does that play in when you're trying to write in kind of two separate, like one is a kid and one is an older adult?
Yeah, it was. Luckily, I didn't have to bounce back and forth too much between those modes, because I actually wrote the first version of this was all David's point of view, and I worked with him being a young child up to Night of the Living Res, and I finished writing that book, and there's no D, and I finished writing that book, and I was like, wow, this is terrible. Nobody would enjoy reading this, because it was just sort of the same monotonous character over and over again. There was no underlying connection, right? And you think of a story collection, you pick one up, and it's always different characters, different situations, different settings, but this was the same place, same character, same people. And I just stumbled upon Dee by accident, and then the question became, okay, if this is David, what happened? Why is he the way he is now? What happened to his family? And I was able to work in Dee's character when David's was pretty much done.
Yeah.
Adds another element to the story.
Right.
Yeah.
As far as why he is the way he is, what is the significance for you of it being based on the Penobscot Reservation where you grew up?
Yeah, I think there's very little literature out there in mainstream publishing that features Penobscot characters. I could think of Gregory Brown's The Lowering Days, which is a novel that came out within the past 2 years, I believe, that had Penobscot characters in it. I don't believe he's a native, but this, for me, it just feels wonderful to have that book on the shelf in Boston, New York, from the East Coast to the West Coast, and having that representation there that I don't think has ever really, been there before.
Yeah.
And finally, before we cut over to break, one of the last questions I had was, any future? Any next step? Another book's coming out? I know this one just came out on the 5th.
I know, just
so
on the
it's
5th.
brand new,
Yeah.
but any future work that you're working on?
Yeah, I think we don't know the season yet, but 2024. Be on the lookout for 2024.
Okay.
Cool.
All right. So
congratulations.
Thank you.
Make sure to grab your copy and be on the lookout for 2024. I'm sure there's a lot more coming, but we'll throw it over to Devin Biggs. He has another check for our forecast.